The neon skyline of New Avalon shimmered like a deranged artist's fever dream, a kaleidoscope of colors bleeding into the perpetual smog that blanketed the sprawling metropolis. But tonight, there was something wrong with the city. The air hummed with an almost imperceptible frequency, a sound that made the skin crawl and the teeth ache, as though the fabric of reality itself was straining under some unknown weight. No one noticed the changes at first. In the heart of Sector Theta, where the gutters ran slick with the runoff from biomanufacturing plants, a homeless man named Reg was the first to experience it. He crouched in his usual alley, clutching a steaming cup of synth coffee he'd pilfered from a distracted vendor, when a sharp pain lanced through his skull. His vision fractured into shards of light, each one displaying twisted, impossible vistas. Planets with rivers of molten glass, cities made of bone, and skies teeming with writhing things that looked back at him. Then the screaming began, not from Reg, from the shadows. It started as a low whisper, a sibilant hiss weaving through the cacophony of the city. Reg turned his head slowly, the movement almost mechanical, to see a figure emerging from the darkness. It wasn't quite a person, though it wore the vague shape of one. Its edges were fluid, rippling like ink spilled into water, and its eyes, if they could be called that, were pits of roiling void. Reg opened his mouth to scream, but the figure moved faster than his thoughts. With a single touch, it dissolved him into a fine black mist that lingered in the air, briefly forming the shape of his horrified expression before dissipating. Far above the grimy streets of Sector Theta, Dr. Alara Quinn stared out the window of her penthouse laboratory. She was a woman of science and secrets, her reputation forged in the crucible of genetic experimentation and cybernetic augmentation. The black aurora shimmering across the sky had caught her attention hours ago, and she had been running simulations ever since. "Alara," a voice crackled from the intercom. "You might want to see this." She stepped over to the wall-mounted screen and pressed a button. The image of her assistant, a young man named Finn with nervous eyes and a tendency to overshare, appeared. He was standing in the lab's observation chamber, his face pale. "The sample," he stammered, "it's reacting." Alara frowned. The sample was a piece of alien biological material recovered from a derelict spacecraft that had crash-landed in the Arctic 3 years ago. It had been inert for months, a curiosity that defied classification. But now, on the monitor, she could see it writhing and pulsating in its containment field. As she watched, the sample began to extrude tendrils, each one tipped with a tiny, blinking eye. The containment alarms blared, and the glass of the chamber began to spiderweb with cracks. Across the city, strange occurrences multiplied. In Sector Gamma, an entire subway car of passengers vanished mid-commute, leaving behind only their clothing and a pervasive smell of ozone. In the corporate towers of Sector Alpha, high-ranking executives began babbling incoherently during board meetings, their words forming intricate patterns that seemed to burn into the air. In a dimly lit dive bar on the outskirts of Sector Omicron, a washed-up detective named Marcus Kane nursed a glass of something that claimed to be whiskey. The patrons around him muttered nervously about the black aurora and the disappearances, but Marcus kept his head down. He had seen too much in his career to be rattled by a few ghost stories. That was until the bartender's face split open like a flower in bloom, revealing a pulsating mass of teeth and tendrils beneath. The city's descent into madness was swift. Those who could fled, though the further they traveled from New Avalon, the more the world seemed to warp and twist. Roads stretched endlessly into horizons that didn't exist, and the stars above rearranged themselves into alien constellations that pulsed with malevolent intent. Alara, Marcus, and a ragtag group of survivors found themselves drawn together by forces beyond their comprehension. They were hunted by the shadow things, creatures that seemed to bleed into existence from the black aurora itself. Each survivor carried a fragment of knowledge, a piece of the puzzle that hinted at the true nature of the phenomenon. Alara's research revealed that the aurora was not a natural event, but a dimensional rift, a tear in the fabric of reality caused by the alien sample's reaction to an experimental energy field. Marcus, haunted by visions of his deceased partner, discovered that his nightmares were premonitions, guiding him toward a hidden truth buried deep within the city. And Finn, though terrified, began to exhibit strange abilities, his body adapting in ways that defied human biology. The group ventured deeper into the heart of New Avalon, where the rift pulsated like a malignant wound in the sky. Along the way, they encountered horrors that defied explanation. Buildings that wept blood, streets that looped endlessly, and whispers that spoke in the voices of lost loved ones. As they approached the epicenter, the city began to crumble around them. The sky above twisted into a vortex of black and red, and the ground beneath their feet shifted like a living thing. The rift beckoned, its pulsating light promising both salvation and oblivion. But the true horror was not the rift itself. It was what lay beyond it. Would you like me to continue writing? This story will build its tension seamlessly, weaving horror, surrealism, and dark comedy into a narrative that grips the reader until the final word. Let me know how you'd like to proceed. The closer they came to the rift, the more the world dissolved into madness. It wasn't just the city anymore. The laws of physics bent like elastic bands, snapping back in grotesque ways. Marcus swore he saw his own reflection step out of a shattered storefront window, only to grin at him with teeth far too sharp. Finn's hands began emitting faint trails of light that danced and twisted into indecipherable symbols before vanishing. Even Alara, who prided herself on her unshakable rationality, found herself slipping into fugue states, waking up mid-conversation with no memory of what she'd been saying. And then there were the others. The streets were littered with the broken remnants of what used to be people. Some writhed in silent agony, their bodies twisted and fused with the asphalt, their mouths opening and closing as though gasping for air that no longer existed. Others had become something worse. Hunters, their features mangled into grotesque caricatures, their eyes voids of black that swallowed the light. They moved with a purpose, as if driven by an unseen force. "It's watching us," Finn whispered, his voice trembling. Alara glanced at him. "What's watching us?" He didn't answer, only pointed toward the rift. Above them, the black aurora undulated like a living thing, its tendrils reaching down to caress the city's skeletal skyline. The rift pulsed in time with their steps, a low thrum reverberating through their chests. It felt like a heartbeat, only wrong, too fast, too irregular. The group reached the Nexus Tower, the highest point in New Avalon and the origin of the rift. Its once gleaming surface was now a jagged, obsidian monolith, covered in pulsating veins of something alive. The entrance yawned open like a mouth, beckoning them inside. "We go in, we end this," Alara said, though her voice lacked conviction. Marcus snorted. "Yeah, because charging into the maw of a nightmare always ends well." "No one's asking for heroics," Alara snapped. "But standing out here isn't an option." Finn stared at the tower, his face pale. It's talking to me." "What?" Marcus turned to him. "What do you mean, talking?" "It knows we're here," Finn murmured, his eyes glazed over. "It wants us to come inside. It's waiting." Marcus drew his pistol, though the gesture felt laughable in the face of the horrors they'd witnessed. Still, the weight of it in his hand was comforting. "Well, let's not keep it waiting then." Inside the tower, the air was thick and suffocating, reeking of copper and decay. The walls pulsed faintly, as though alive, and the floor beneath them squelched with each step. Finn's glow illuminated the path ahead, casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted like malevolent spirits. Alara led the way. Clutching a small device she'd cobbled together from her lab equipment. It emitted a high-pitched whine that seemed to resonate with the tower, causing the walls to shudder. "This will destabilize the rift," she explained, though her tone was more desperate than confident. "If we can reach the core." A guttural scream interrupted her, echoing from somewhere deep within the structure. It was followed by a wet, dragging sound, like something massive pulling itself across the ground. "What the hell was that?" Marcus hissed, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Nothing good," Alara muttered. "Keep moving." The scream came again, closer this time. It was joined by others, a cacophony of anguish that set their teeth on edge. Finn stumbled, clutching his head. "It's in my mind," he gasped. "It's trying to get in. Fight it." Alara snapped, grabbing his arm. "We're almost there." They rounded a corner and froze. The corridor ahead was blocked by a mass of writhing flesh, an amalgamation of human limbs, faces, and other, less identifiable parts. It pulsated, groaning and screaming, as if aware of its own horrific existence. Back up, Marcus shouted, but the mass surged toward them, filling the corridor like a living tide. Alara yanked Finn to his feet, and the group sprinted in the opposite direction. The mass gave chase, its twisted faces screaming in unison. Marcus fired his pistol, but the bullets vanished into the undulating horror without effect. "This way," Alara shouted, veering down another passage. The walls narrowed, forcing them to run single file. The mass squeezed after them, tearing chunks from the walls as it came. They burst into a massive chamber at the tower's core. In the center of the room was the rift, a swirling vortex of black and red, its edges rimmed with flickering light. It pulsed like a beating heart, sending waves of nausea through their bodies. "We have to end this," Alara shouted, raising her device. "Cover me." Marcus turned to face the pursuing mass, his jaw set. "You better make it quick, document." The mass surged into the chamber, and Marcus opened fire, the muzzle flashes casting grotesque shadows across the walls. Finn collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as the light from his hands grew brighter. "It's too loud," he gasped. "It's inside me." "Hold on," Alara shouted, furiously adjusting the device. It began to emit a piercing tone, causing the rift to shudder violently. The mass halted, as though uncertain, its many faces contorted in pain. The room trembled, and the rift began to shrink, pulling the light and sound into itself. But as it did, the black aurora outside intensified, its tendrils smashing through the walls of the chamber and latching onto the survivors. Marcus screamed as one wrapped around his arm, pulling him toward the rift. Finn's glow erupted into a blinding flash, and the mass writhed in agony, retreating toward the walls. Alara screamed something, but her words were lost in the deafening roar of the collapsing reality. The rift flickered, its light growing dimmer. But from within, something vast and unknowable began to emerge. As the rift pulsed one final time, a shape began to push through its surface, something that defied logic and comprehension. It was vast, impossibly vast, its form a cascade of shifting geometries and colors that seemed to devour the very concept of light. It wasn't just a creature. It was a presence, a force that radiated malevolence and indifference in equal measure. Marcus, still struggling against the black tendril wrapped around his arm, felt his sanity teeter on the edge of an abyss. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. It wasn't meant to be seen, not by human eyes. Alara screamed, "We have to close it now. Finn, get up." Finn didn't respond. He was on his knees, trembling, his hands glowing brighter with each passing second. The light pouring from him was no longer just illuminating the room. It was burning it. The tendrils of the aurora recoiled from his radiance, hissing like living things in pain. I can't stop it," Finn stammered, his voice distant. "It's in me. It's always been in me." "What the hell does that mean?" Marcus shouted, tugging against the tendril, dragging him closer to the rift. Alara didn't answer. She was too busy frantically adjusting her device, its whine rising to an ear-splitting pitch. The rift flickered, its surface rippling violently, but it didn't close. Instead, the thing emerging from it grew larger, more defined. Its edges solidified into grotesque appendages that bent and twisted in ways that hurt to look at. "It's stabilizing itself," Alara shouted, her voice tinged with panic. "The rift is anchoring it to this reality." The tendrils of the black aurora began to spread throughout the room, latching onto the walls, the floor, and even the air itself. The chamber groaned as the fabric of space strained against the unnatural presence. One of the tendrils slithered toward Alara, but she dodged it, clutching her device like a lifeline. "Finn," she screamed, "I need more time." Finn's glowing hands began to shake uncontrollably. "Time? Time for what? There is no time. Don't you see? This thing isn't something we can fight. It's rewriting everything. Then help us stop it." Alara snapped. Finn's head snapped up, his eyes glowing now, too, pure white, like twin suns. "I'm not sure I want to." "What?" Marcus bellowed, still fighting the tendril dragging him closer to the rift. "What the hell are you talking about?" Finn stood slowly, the light radiating from him intensifying. His voice, when he spoke, was layered, as though a dozen other voices were speaking through him. "You don't understand. None of you do. This isn't just some alien entity. It's everything. It's the origin, the end, the cycle. And I'm part of it." Alara froze, her blood running cold. What are you saying?" "I didn't want to believe it," Finn said, his voice tinged with sorrow. "But the closer we got, the clearer it became. I wasn't drawn to this thing by chance. I'm connected to it. We all are, in some way. But me? I'm special. I think I was meant to help it. Help it destroy everything." Marcus snarled. "Over my dead body." Finn turned to him, his glowing eyes locking onto Marcus. "That could be arranged." Before anyone could react, Finn raised his hands. The light pouring from him exploded outward, slamming into Marcus, Alara, and the Aurora tendrils. Marcus was thrown backward, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Alara dropped her device, the high-pitched whine abruptly cutting off. The rift pulsed violently, as though in response to Finn's energy. Alara struggled to her feet, her ears ringing. "Finn, listen to me. This thing, it's using you. It's manipulating you." Finn smiled, but it was a hollow, alien expression. "No, Dr. Quinn, I'm becoming it." The rift surged, and the thing emerging from it let out a sound, a low, guttural roar that resonated through the chamber like an earthquake. The walls cracked, and chunks of the ceiling began to fall. The air grew heavy, suffused with a sense of impending doom. Alara grabbed her device, her hands trembling. "If I can just—" A tendril lashed out, wrapping around her leg and yanking her off her feet. She screamed, clawing at the ground, but the tendril was too strong. It dragged her closer to the rift, toward the pulsating entity that now loomed over them all. Marcus, coughing and bloodied, staggered to his feet. He raised his pistol, aiming it at Finn. "You've lost your damn mind, kid." Finn tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Have I? Or have I finally found my purpose?" Marcus pulled the trigger. The bullet never reached its target. A tendril shot out from Finn's glowing form, catching the projectile mid-air and dissolving it into nothing. Marcus stared, his hand trembling, as Finn approached him. "You can't stop it," Finn said softly. "This is inevitable." Alara, desperate, activated her device again. This time, the whine it emitted was different, lower, deeper, and far more ominous. The rift trembled, and for a moment, the thing emerging from it hesitated. Finn turned to her, his expression darkening. "What are you doing?" "Ending this," she growled. The device's pitch rose to a deafening crescendo, and the rift began to collapse in on itself. The tendrils of the Aurora recoiled, and the chamber shook violently. But Finn didn't falter. He raised his hands, and the light pouring from him flared like a supernova. "You don't understand," he said, his voice reverberating with otherworldly power. "You can't end this. This isn't just an event. It's a transformation. For all of us." The rift pulsed one final time, and the thing emerging from it began to fully materialize. A shape so vast, so incomprehensible, it seemed to consume the room and the very concept of space itself. And then, the world went white. When the light faded, the world had changed. Alara blinked, her vision struggling to adjust. The chamber was gone, or at least it wasn't the same. The walls were no longer solid, but instead appeared as shimmering, translucent membranes, pulsing faintly like the skin of some enormous creature. The air felt heavier, denser, and the faint hum of the rift had been replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional wet, slithering sound. Marcus groaned somewhere nearby. Alara turned to see him slumped against one of the pulsing walls, his face pale and streaked with blood. His pistol lay at his side, useless now. "Marcus," she rasped, crawling toward him. Are you okay?" He opened one eye, giving her a wry, pained smile. "Define okay. Because if it includes seeing nightmares come to life, then yeah, I'm peachy." Alara tried to respond, but her words caught in her throat as she noticed Finn, or what Finn had become. He stood at the center of the transformed space, his body no longer entirely human. The glow emanating from him had dimmed, but his form shimmered and shifted, as though it couldn't decide on a single shape. His face, once boyish and uncertain, now bore an unsettling serenity, his glowing eyes fixed on something only he could see. "This is it," Finn murmured, his voice layered with echoes. "The beginning and the end." "What the hell does that mean?" Marcus growled, pushing himself upright despite the obvious pain. Finn turned to them, his expression unreadable. "You can't understand it. You're still clinging to your human perceptions, your limited grasp of reality. But this is freedom. This is truth." Alara forced herself to stand, gripping her makeshift device like a lifeline. "Finn, whatever that thing is, it's not freedom. It's destruction. It's chaos. You have to fight it." Finn tilted his head, his shimmering form rippling like water. "Why would I fight? This is what I was meant for. What we were all meant for." The space around them began to shift and distort, the translucent walls undulating like living things. Strange shapes moved just beyond their surface. Vast, alien forms that defied logic, their outlines writhing and changing as though rejecting any attempt to be understood. The air grew colder, and Alara's breath came in visible puffs, each one lingering in the still air far longer than it should have. Marcus pointed at the shapes beyond the walls, his voice trembling. What are those?" Finn smiled faintly. "They're the architects, the ones who made this universe, and countless others. They've been waiting, watching, for the right moment to return." "Return?" Alara repeated, her voice rising. "Return to do what?" "To reclaim what's theirs," Finn said simply. "To reshape everything." "No," Alara whispered, shaking her head. "You don't know what you're saying. This isn't some divine revelation, Finn. This is annihilation." Finn's smile faded, and for a moment, something human flickered in his eyes. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't feel it, every second, tearing me apart and rebuilding me? But it's not just destruction. It's creation. It's evolution." "Alara," Marcus muttered, his voice low and urgent. "We've got to do something. Now." "I'm trying," she hissed back, her fingers fumbling with the controls on her device. The mechanism was damaged, sparking intermittently, but it was her only chance. Finn turned back to the center of the room, where the rift, or what was left of it, still pulsated faintly. Its edges were frayed, but it hadn't closed completely. Instead, it seemed to be stabilizing, its light growing stronger with each pulse. "They're almost here," Finn said, almost reverently. "And when they arrive, everything will change." "Not if I can help it," Alara muttered. She activated the device. This time, it emitted a low, grinding tone, like the groan of a dying star. The walls of the chamber trembled, and the shapes beyond writhed violently, their outlines blurring. Finn staggered, clutching his head. "What are you doing?" "Stopping this," Alara snapped. "Whatever it takes." Finn's form flickered, his features distorting as though caught between dimensions. His voice was fractured, layered with dozens of others, all screaming in unison. "You can't stop it. You'll destroy everything." "Better that than let those things through," Marcus growled, stepping forward despite the pain etched across his face. The rift began to collapse, its light dimming. The shapes beyond the walls shrieked, their inhuman cries piercing the air. Finn fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the ground as his body spasmed. You don't understand, he cried, his voice raw. You're tearing apart the foundation of existence. If the rift closes now, the damage will be irreversible. Good. Marcus spat. Let's give them something to remember us by. The rift pulsed one final time, its light flaring so brightly that Alara and Marcus were forced to shield their eyes. The chamber shook violently, and the translucent walls began to crack, black veins spreading across their surfaces. Finn screamed, a sound of pure anguish and fury. His form erupted into a blinding explosion of light, and for a moment, he was everywhere and nowhere, his voice echoing in their minds. You can't stop it, he whispered, even as his body dissolved into the collapsing rift. This is only the beginning. And then silence. When Alara opened her eyes, she was lying on cold, cracked asphalt. The sky above was a deep, unnatural black, devoid of stars. The air was still, the city eerily quiet. Marcus groaned nearby, struggling to sit up. Are we alive? Alara nodded, though she wasn't sure. The rift was gone, and so was Finn. But the world around them felt wrong, like a pale imitation of what it had been. In the distance, the faint hum of the black aurora began to rise again. Alara stood in the fractured remains of New Avalon, the once bustling city, now a broken labyrinth of jagged ruins and twisted architecture. The sky above remained an oppressive black, and the faint hum of the black aurora still lingered like a cruel joke, a reminder that the nightmare wasn't over. Beside her, Marcus limped forward, his hand pressed tightly against a wound on his side. He didn't complain, but his gritted teeth and sweat-soaked face betrayed the agony he was enduring. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken doubts and fears. Where are we even going? Marcus finally asked, his voice raw and gravelly. Alara didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the horizon, where the faint outline of the Nexus Tower still stood. It was smaller now, as though the collapse of the rift had stripped it of its unnatural grandeur. But it wasn't gone. Neither was the black aurora. There's one last thing I need to try, she said quietly. Marcus stopped, frowning. You're kidding. After all of this? That thing, whatever it was, it's gone. Finn's gone. What's left to fight? It's not about fighting anymore, Alara replied, turning to face him. Her eyes were hollow, dark circles etched beneath them. It's about fixing this. Finn was right about one thing. The rift wasn't just destruction. It was a transformation. And now, everything is out of balance. And you think you can fix it? Marcus asked, a bitter laugh escaping him. With what? That broken science project of yours. Alara's jaw tightened. I have to try. The walk to the Nexus Tower was agonizingly slow. The streets were littered with debris, and strange, half-formed shapes lurked in the shadows. They didn't attack, but their presence was suffocating, a constant reminder of the fragile barrier between this world and whatever lay beyond. When they finally reached the base of the tower, Alara hesitated. The entrance was warped, a jagged hole that oozed a faint, pulsing light. She gripped her damaged device tightly, her knuckles white. You don't have to come, she said to Marcus. He snorted. And missed the grand finale? Not a chance. Together, they stepped into the tower. The core chamber was unrecognizable. Where before it had been a living, pulsating nightmare, it was now a cavernous void. The rift was gone, but its residual energy lingered, swirling in faint, ghostly patterns across the walls. At the center of the room stood a pedestal of jagged black stone, and atop it floated a single shard of light, the last remnant of the rift. Alara approached it slowly, her heart pounding. The shard pulsed faintly, as though aware of her presence. What is that? Marcus asked, his voice hushed. It's the anchor, Alara said. The rift's core. The only thing holding this reality together right now. Marcus stared at her, realization dawning. You're not just trying to fix it, are you? You're trying to destroy it. If I destroy it, this world collapses, Alara said, her voice trembling. But if I stabilize it, maybe I can undo some of the damage. Or maybe you make things worse, Marcus countered. Did you think of that? I don't have the luxury of certainty, Alara shot back. This is the only chance we have. Alara activated her device, the whine cutting through the silence like a knife. The shard pulsed in response, its light growing brighter. The ground beneath them trembled, and the faint hum of the black aurora grew louder. Marcus stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for his pistol. "What's happening?" Alara didn't answer. She was too focused, her fingers flying across the device's controls. The shard began to spin, its light spreading across the room in waves. The patterns on the walls shimmered and shifted, and the air grew thick with static. And then the voices started. They were faint at first, indistinct whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But as the shard's light intensified, the voices grew louder, more coherent. They spoke in a language Marcus couldn't understand, but Alara seemed to. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. "What are they saying?" Marcus demanded. Alara's lips trembled. "They're asking me to choose." "Choose what?" "Whether to let them in," she whispered. The shard's light grew blinding, and the room began to fracture, cracks spreading through the air itself. Alara's device sparked and hissed, its components straining against the energy it was channeling. "I can seal it," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the energy around them. "I can stabilize the shard and rebuild the barrier." But what?" Marcus shouted. "If I do, we'll lose this chance," Alara said. "The world will stay broken, but it'll survive. If I let them through, they might fix it, but it won't be our world anymore." Marcus stared at her, his face pale. "You're saying we have to choose between survival and surrender?" Alara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what to do." The shard pulsed one final time, its light flickering as though it, too, was waiting for their decision. The voices grew louder, more insistent, their tone pleading. Marcus looked at Alara, then at the shard, his hand clenched into a fist. "You do what you have to do. Document. I'll back your play." Alara closed her eyes, her hands trembling on the controls of her device. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, she made her choice. The shard exploded in a burst of light, and the world dissolved around them. When Alara opened her eyes, she was standing in a field of golden grass. The sky above was a soft, pale blue, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of something sweet and familiar. Marcus stood beside her, his wounds gone, his expression one of quiet disbelief. "Is this?" he began. "I don't know," Alara said softly. "Maybe it's a new beginning." The voices were gone. The black aurora was gone, and in their place was silence, beautiful, peaceful silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, Alara smiled. The world had changed, but it was still theirs. The end.